Hello and welcome to Just a Damn Nerd. Thanks for clicking on the video. Now, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It truly helps out. And today, we're talking about the Callisto protocol.
Did you know that they call Callisto the dead moon? Dead.
I was incredibly excited for the Callisto protocol when it was first announced about a year and a half ago. I incredibly love survival horror games, particularly sci-fi survival horror games. While survival horror has had a bit of a renaissance in recent years, with a rebirth for Resident Evil, an upcoming return to Silent Hill 2, and more indie games than I can count on both hands, the survival horror genre has actually been doing very well. But sci-fi survival horror has not. I can't really think personally of any giant sci-fi survival horror game since Dead Space 2 came out. Maybe that's just because the developers don't believe the genre is that popular, but personally, I can't get enough sci-fi survival horror. So when the Callisto protocol was first announced, I was very, very excited. When I found out that Glenn Schofield and more than 30 members of the original Visceral team who actually worked on Dead Space had founded a new independent game studio and were making the Callisto protocol, I assumed, like many others did, that the Callisto protocol was going to be a successor to Dead Space. And I was unbelievably excited. Dead Space is one of my top 10 games of all time, and I believed wholeheartedly the problems caused for Visceral were 100% caused by Electronic Arts and Android Wilson. Unfortunately, now that I played the Callisto protocol, I now see that maybe EA wasn't the whole problem for Visceral. Unfortunately, the Callisto protocol made the absolute worst first impression you could possibly make. With such extreme shader compilation stutter on PC, it was practically unplayable, even with the most powerful cards.
Disastrously poor at launch. There are many issues with this game on PC, but the most significant issue is that Callisto Protocol on PC is an Unreal Engine 4 game, and specifically an Unreal Engine 4 game that does not precompile its shaders. So like nearly every Unreal Engine game I've reviewed in the recent years, that means Callisto Protocol on PC has awful shader compilation stutter.
The Epic Game Store actually pulled the game down and relaunched it the next day, or a couple hours later actually, as they waited for the guys at Striking Distance to get the patch out to fix the stuttering issue. And I will give some credit to the folks at Striking Distance, as the patch to actually fix the game's stuttering issue on PC did launch about 24 hours after the game did, which is pretty impressive, especially when you consider that 343 Industries couldn't fix Big Team Battle for 6 months. So it's impressive for an indie studio to get the patch out so quickly. Now, this patch didn't fully iron out the stuttering issue, but it did make the game playable. However, the patch that came out very recently pretty much completely eliminated the stuttering issue on PC. Thank God for that. Unfortunately, the plethora of performance issues have not been entirely fixed by the patches to date. Unless you're playing this game on the PlayStation 5, you're inevitably going to make some kind of compromise. The PlayStation 5 is the only platform where ray tracing works properly. Both Xboxes remove ray tracing altogether, which is completely unacceptable when you consider the fact that the Xbox Series X has a 12 teraflop GPU and the PS5 has a 10. It's very slight advantage, but it does mean that the Xbox should be able to do anything the PlayStation can do. At best, the game should be even. However, the majority of the time, the Xbox will have a very slight edge in performance and graphic quality. Where it really starts to get ridiculous is the fact that even running an NVIDIA RTX 4090, an 86 teraflop graphic card, 86 versus 10 for the PlayStation, you still cannot use ray tracing. The PC version of the game, ray tracing is broken. If you turn it on all the ray tracing all the way up with an NVIDIA RTX 4090, you will find your game consistently running below 60 FPS. As a matter of fact, many times it'll run all the way down to 25 FPS, and it could run as high as 90. I also don't have the capture technology to prove this, but I feel like there is some other issue here as well, because even if I set the game to run at a lock 30, it still feels really bad to play. A lot of times games at 30 feel a little off to start with, but you can kind of adjust to them. But the Callisto protocol never feels good to play. The only way I have found to fix this is to turn off ray traced reflections and ray traced shadows. This will get an NVIDIA RTX 4090 up to around 130 frames a second. And I couldn't really find any other way to fix this because this game is heavily CPU limited, because the game is extremely single threaded.
CPU in moments when you are CPU limited in this game. So it is very single thread limited apparently.
As the good folks from Digital Foundry pointed out, this game only saturates part of your CPU cores. This means that it's the CPU causing the problem and not the GPU, which is why a 3090 and a 4090 will get similar performance at this game. Unfortunately, the game being CPU limited means that you can't turn on FSR2 on any setting to get your game to a lock 60 with ray tracing on. You can turn it to performance if you want, but you may get a 2 or 3 frames per second advantage. Now this is noteworthy because the game feels absolutely terrible to play on PC. It has no ray tracing on Xbox Series consoles. It's a complete train wreck to play on the last gen consoles, and the PS5 version is the only one that actually runs smoothly. So if you're not on PS5, you probably, at the very least, want to wait another few months to actually buy this game until the guys at Striking Distance figure out how to make the damn PC and Xbox versions work properly. It does feel like the PC and Xbox versions of the Callisto protocol were afterthoughts, that the guys at Striking Distance considered the PlayStation first, second, and third and made sure that version worked properly prior to launch, and then just kind of figured they'd fix the other versions after they came out. It's also absolutely unacceptable for a game to be single-threaded in 2022, and I guarantee you the console version is also single-threaded. So, enough on performance, let's talk about the game, because no matter who you are, you have heard the complaints about the game's performance. The problem with the Callisto protocol is once you get beyond the performance, you still don't have a very good game here. We're going to start with the game's story. Now, full disclosure, I only made it about 75% of the way through the game, and I don't feel like dragging myself to the finish line, nor do I believe it would change any part of my opinion on this game, because the game is 99% combat, and the combat is terrible. We'll get to that in just a minute. So the immediate and first problem with the story is I can't even remember a single character's name to actually do this review, because they're all so goddamn forgettable. So we're just going to call them generic white guy, generic black guy, and discount Randy Orton and generic Asian chick, because that's basically all they are. So you play as generic white guy, or generic action movie white guy, who is actually played by a big name actor, but it doesn't matter, because no matter how talented your acting skills are, you can't uplift nothing, which is what this game has in it, nothing. The game opens up with a news report of an alleged terrorist attack. Your characters have some generic dialogue, and then the ship is very quickly boarded by these terrorists, or so we're told. These terrorists are able to damage the ship, forcing you to crash land on Callisto, a prison planet, which honestly feels more inevitable than entertaining. Once you crash, you're pulled out of the wreckage by the prison staff, some badass mech bots, and some random nobody no one cares about. Both you and discount Asian chick survived the crash, while your co-pilot is killed in the crash, and her 4 supposed terrorist allies are also killed in the crash. However, even though you're the victim, for whatever reason, the warden decides that he wants you put in a cell as well. Why that would possibly make any sense, don't ask me. Because it's not like our character in the beginning is made out to be some kind of super badass like Riddick, or some kind of military specialist, or some kind of government official, which hoarding in a prison would actually help a corrupt warden. He seems like he's just another guy, and there's no real reason the warden should try to hoard him. And unfortunately, the problem with characters not being flushed out pretty much continues throughout the entire game. So, what should have happened next was you would be arrested and then spend 30 minutes in the prison getting to know all the other prisoners, getting to know your character, and getting to understand why the discount Asian chick is our enemy, and also why the warden's the enemy. But instead, we're taken on a prison transport where we meet Discount Randy Orton. Discount Randy Orton basically tells you he's a big man, and that's pretty much the entirety of his contributing to this opening scene. Also, back on the technical side for a second, during this opening scene, for me personally, Discount Randy Orton's mouth didn't move. This made it kind of funny when he's threatening me with a stone face. Unfortunately, I don't have footage of this recorded because I restarted the game after the update came out, although I will say Discount Randy Orton has a presence to him and may have made for a very interesting villain. Unfortunately, he dies very early. So you wake up in your cell and people are screaming, running around. You escape your cell and find this other inmate who's like 3 cells down from you, who's also managed to his cell, who we're going to call generic black guy, and he essentially becomes like the guy guiding you around the prison in the early parts of the game. Don't ask me how or why that makes sense. Until later in the game, he's actually killed, and it's supposed to be an emotional moment, but since you don't actually get to know anyone in this game, including your main character, I just couldn't be bothered to care. Unfortunately, the Callisto protocol doesn't get much more interesting after the opening. You essentially run through room after room clearing enemies that get very bad audio logs that are more on the level of Halo Infinite than Doom 3. Plus, you cannot listen to them if you close your inventory. This is an extremely frustrating addition, as you're forced to stand still and stare at a screen and listen to the audio logs. Now, the audio logs try to tell a lot of this game's story, but they do it so badly no one actually gives a fuck. I keep thinking that one day developers will learn that what made Doom 3's audio logs so good, besides how well written they were, was that you were able to turn off your inventory and walk around in the dark rooms while listening to people being ripped apart by monsters and zombies. Standing here staring at a blank inventory screen, listening to an audio log from a character I've never met, don't know, and don't care about, does not make me scared or invested. Unfortunately, Callisto Protocol tries heavily to rely on audio logs for the majority of its story. You pretty much get cutscenes at the beginning and the end of the areas that you're in, and for the most part they're generic and boring and tedious. I never at any point felt a connection to any of the characters. And the generic Asian chick, who you have to try to ally yourself with later in the game, is massively cringe, useless, and frustrating. The villains are virtually non-existent, or if they are existent, they are so tedious and boring, I have a hard time even remembering them. Discount Randy Orton supposedly dies pretty early in the game, and your supposed buddy also dies pretty early in the game. So with no character attachment, and no really interesting or well-written story that makes you just giddy to see what the next area is, this wannabe Resident Evil clone hopes to be propped up by its combat. But unfortunately, the combat in the Callisto Protocol is its absolute worst element. Now, there are a variety of guns and telekinetic powers, like the ability to grab, in the Callisto Protocol, but its primary form of combat is melee. Now, there's a few problems with melee being the primary form of combat in a horror game. So before I get into why the Callisto Protocol fails in its combat, I wanted to point out why I think melee combat in a horror game can be fundamentally flawed. And it's a real simple reason. If I am running up to enemies and beating them to death with a stick, then those enemies don't seem that intimidating. As a matter of fact, you can fight 5 or 6 enemies with a melee weapon in most melee games, that's not a very good idea in most hall games, as the enemies in the hall games need to be intimidating. The only reason this works so well in the Condemned is because the majority of fights in that game were one-on-one, and they were difficult. While the Callisto Protocol lays too heavily into an action game's roots, meaning you can fight anywhere from 5 to 10 enemies at a time. This means your character is able to beat the big scary monsters to death with a lightning stick. And a 5-on-1 fight. How scary are these monsters if that's the case? And I think fundamentally melee in a hall game is a bad decision. But either way, the Callisto Protocol makes it much, much worse. The Callisto Protocol's combat was kind of like this. You approach an enemy, and while the game doesn't zoom in, it sort of feels like it does. It auto-locks onto said enemy. You hold right and left on the joystick to dodge, and you use the right trigger to melee. Now, what happens is you end up getting in a robotic attack pattern. You run up to an enemy, you press the trigger 3 times, the third one will be a knockback. You wait till the enemy runs back, you dodge, then you might have to dodge again, but you normally can just repeat the process, and typically if you do that 2 to 3 times, the enemy dies. Fairly early in the game introduces guns, but like a lot of survival horror games, really doesn't give you enough ammo to use them. Plus, the guns take anywhere from 3 to 8 shots to kill a single enemy, so they're not very effective either. However, they try to use the guns to change up the melee combat a little bit. So once you have a gun, you run up to the enemies, you dodge, melee 3 times, and then you can pull the left trigger and right trigger in rapid succession in order to get an auto-targeted shot on the enemy. The enemy will get up and run back at you, and you can do it again, and they die after 2 instead of 3. This, unfortunately, didn't make the combat feel more fast and fluid. Plus, this dodging system in the game is kind of annoying. It almost does feel like a QTE game, where you're just performing QTEs in order to kill the enemy. You dodge to the left, then you dodge to the right, then you pull the trigger. I mean, you could literally do this by button prompts. You could have yourself run up to an enemy, tap the trigger until a certain point, then dodge, and tap the trigger, then dodge. It doesn't feel fast and fluid, it feels more scripted. And unfortunately, the addition of guns doesn't change the game's combat as much as it should, because you never have enough damn ammo to use the fucking things. It makes more sense to continue to use the game's frustrating, clunky melee system. I believe on some level, they were attempting to rip off the FromSoft combat. And I'm not going to lie to anyone and tell you guys I like FromSoft combat. You can look at my channel and know I don't. I think it's clunky. However, the FromSoft combat is 10 times better than what you get in the Callisto Protocol. The Callisto Protocol almost feels like a survival horror game where I've run out of ammo and can only use the damn knife. If they made the knife in Resident Evil kill enemies in 7 hits, that feels a lot like the Callisto Protocol. I sometimes wonder if the game isn't designed for me to use guns, but the game designers just did such a piss poor job of designing the ammo amount that it feels like they want you to use melee weapons. But anyway, the game isn't helped out either once the telekinesis power is added. So, the first problem with the telekinesis power is when you first get it, it burns out insanely quick. This isn't like Dead Space or some other games where you have like 4 uses of it and you can hold the enemy as long as you want. Instead of being like that, this game, it burns up every second you're holding an enemy. And your initial amount of being able to use it is about 2 seconds. Meaning you pretty much fucked. There's really no way to throw an enemy into anything unless you're already aiming at the spikes. Now you can upgrade this grab so it actually lasts longer, but it's still relatively ineffective. There's a few massive problems with it. One, throwing enemies into walls doesn't really do anything. Now you can throw them to spike walls or throw them off sides or do a number of other things. However, Callisto Protocol uses money like XP, which you have to pick up off the bodies of dead enemies. So if you throw an enemy off a side, you get no XP for killing it. If you throw an enemy into most of the big machinery in the game, you get no XP for killing it. This really doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, as the game is punishing you for using something other than its melee or shooting. So because of that, I often find the best way to use the grab in this game is to actually grab an enemy from across the room and pull them over to you so you can go through the QTE style melee process as quickly as possible, because this combat engine does not work when you're fighting multiple opponents. but it seems like the guys at Striking Distance didn't actually play this game, because there are often times where you're fighting huge amounts of multiple opponents. The decisions made to turn this into some kind of odd 1v1 melee game, all to try to rip off FromSoft, makes for a very frustrating experience. Nobody is going to argue the Callisto protocol is hard but fair, because there's nothing fair about this game. Also, enemies tend to do random damage amounts, which is also stupid. The same exact enemy types would do random damage from time to time. You can get hit one time and die. You can also get hit 2 times and die. Sometimes you can get hit 5 times and you don't die. But it seems like the game kind of just decides whenever you're going to die. As I said earlier, it almost feels like this game is running a bunch of QTEs. If you do not do the QTE properly, then you die. So since the enemies cause random damage, it can be really difficult sometimes to judge whether or not you should use the game's health packs. Much like its contemporaries in the genre, health packs are limited. So are other resources throughout the game, so you don't want to waste your health packs. Plus, a fair amount of enemies drop health when you kill them instead of money, which pointed out was XP already, that will refill a good chunk of your health, meaning once again, you really don't want to use the health injectors unless you have to. Of course, because it's a modern game, the use of the health injectors take at least 55 lifetimes. Obviously that was sarcasm, but it takes a very long time to actually use one of the game's health injectors. This means it's pretty much unreasonable to try to use them in combat. The game does have a half-baked stealth system in it, but it's fucking terrible. Like a lot of games, the stealth kills are fairly flashy and take a good 30 seconds. And they look kinda cool. The problem is, unlike most games, the enemies in this game spot you almost every time you do a stealth kill. It's almost like they're real. As a matter of fact, stealth in this game feels more like real stealth than actual stealth in a video game. The enemies also spot you if you enter the line of sight at any point from any distance, which, while being realistic, doesn't make for very fun stealth. It's obvious the stealth system was just included in this game because somebody said it had to be. It wasn't something the studio was very excited for. Overall, the combat suite and the Callisto protocol fucking sucks. And when you add on top of that the problems as previously mentioned with the game's story and its frustratingly clunky performance, it makes the combat feel even more frustrating and pointless. The big issue with the Callisto protocol is everything feels pointless. I don't know why I'm supposed to care about escaping a prison with a character they never took the time to introduce me to. I don't know why I'm supposed to care about the game's zombie outbreak when the game doesn't feel like it's just slowly releasing breadcrumbs so I can learn about the zombie outbreak. It feels like the game doesn't care about the zombie outbreak. These could have easily just been a bunch of prison guards you were killing to try to escape prison, which probably would have been a much more interesting game. I don't know why I should care about the game's primary terrorist group when the game does nothing to make me care. I don't know why I should care about the game's corrupt government when the game does nothing to make me care. Just having people running from monsters does not make for a good story. Alright, we're going to wrap this up here. So overall, the Callisto protocol is a broken, clunky mess. I played through 75% of the game, and I still can't give you one interesting story beat, one moment that made me actually want to keep going. The game's frustrating, clunky combat paired with the worst performance of any current gen title leaves the Callisto protocol in a position where, personally, I feel like the game would have been better off if it had just never come out. Unfortunately, the Callisto protocol makes me question whether EA was the problem or not with Dead Space. By every metric, the Callisto protocol is a failure. I can't even think of a good thing to say about the game. And my only disappointment is I have no way to get my $60 back. Don't buy this game. Not even on sale. This game isn't worth $10, it isn't worth $5, it isn't worth free, because you will not want to play this game for more than a couple of hours. I wouldn't even have got as far into it as I did if I wasn't trying to do this video. Everything about this game is terrible. It's a 2 out of 10, you should avoid it. Don't waste your time on money.
Emotional damage!
Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I appreciate you guys watching it and making it to the end. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps out. And I'll see you guys next time. This is a Damn Nerd, signing off.